One thing that we should try to avoid in our code if possible is to reduce the amount of conditional logic. We love to use if, else, switch statements, and all these other things in our code to write methods and to write logic. But all of this conditional logic, even from a general software engineering sense, makes it harder to read our code and harder to guarantee that a particular state that we expect will be reached. It's also easier to go and introduce errors when there's conditional logic. Now, in a security point of view, suddenly errors that we introduce might not be our app crashing, but they might be worse. If we have conditional logic that's incorrect, it might be someone's very private data being stolen by an attacker. So we really don't want to have conditional logic that makes it harder to secure our applications and more likely that we'll make mistakes. The other thing is, if other developers come and read our code, it's not as apparent which security level should be chosen. This example is pretty simple, so probably nobody's going to make a mistake. But in many cases, there might be complex conditional logic, and the more complex this conditional logic gets, the more likely the users of this interface are to make a mistake in its usage. So we'd like to simplify the conditional logic to also avoid the chance that somebody else will look at our code and misinterpret how it's intended to operate. It's also very important from a clarity point of view, because when we audit our code, we would really like to be able to prove or know very certainly that our code is actually secure. If we have conditional logic, it makes it hard to make that argument that yes, this code is always going to operate properly. The final issue that we can see with this security level approach is that the semantics of what security level max means versus security level none aren't really clear. It's not 100% obvious what it means to have maximum security, and whether or not maximum security is good enough to store a particular piece of data. Or maybe it's not good enough, and maybe you need to store that server side somewhere else. And so because there's not a clear meaning to these security levels, somebody who is using our interface may not be able to make an appropriate and reasoned decision about how to securely code the storage of their data. So we would really like to have an interface that makes it clear what the semantics are of the calls that they're making, so that there's no way that they could misinterpret what the security is intended to do. So how could we make this interface even cleaner and more straightforward from a security perspective? Well, if we could remove the conditional logic and refactor our code to look more like this, where we actually have two different methods that have very clear intentions. So by removing that conditional logic, we're going to do two things here. One, we're going to make our code a lot easier to test. It's pretty straightforward to test these methods and to ensure that we are exercising them in a way that will check the different conditions that those methods can go through, because they're going to do the same thing regardless of the input data. So it's much easier to test these methods. The second thing is we're going to make the semantics and the intention of these methods much more obvious, because store data privately and encrypted is pretty clear. Store data with security level max is less obvious as to what that means. So we're making it harder for users of our code to make mistakes when they are building around our security abstractions. Another very important point is if we go and look at places where our API, our abstractions are being used, suddenly it becomes very obvious what's going on at an even greater level of clarity than we had before with our security level approach. Suddenly we can look and we can see the private groups are being stored in a way that is both private and encrypted. And that gives us more information for reasoning about whether or not that is an okay security decision to make. Similarly, we can go and look and see that the profile photo and the homepage URL are both being stored publicly on the SD card. And then we can reason about, is that okay or not? So we have taken something that was helping us to name, our security, and we've increased the semantics, we've increased the richness of the information that's being expressed by the interface so that when somebody else comes along and reads this code, they know exactly what's going on or what should be going on. We've done a lot to improve the clarity of our interfaces and abstractions that we're providing in our application. And we've also helped to eliminate some of the testing complexity and some of the conditional logic that was there that opened us up to mistakes and security vulnerabilities. But there's still some more that we can do to improve the security of these abstractions and interfaces that we're using in our implementation of them.